Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we really try to unpack complex ideas, giving you a shortcut to being, well, truly well-informed.
Glad to be here.
So today, we're looking at something that challenges, I think, a pretty common perception of how democracies actually falter.
Mm-hmm.
You might instinctively picture tanks rolling through the streets,
Yeah.
right? Or maybe sudden violent coup, those really dramatic, overt acts that instantly signal, okay, something fundamental has shifted power-wise.
Right, the classic Hollywood image almost.
Exactly. But what if the biggest threat to democracy today isn't like that at all? What if it's something, I don't know, far more subtle, maybe more insidious, and woven right into the very fabric of law itself?
That's precisely where the research is pointing. That traditional image of a coup, it's a clear, undeniable breach of the democratic order, often a military takeover.
Yeah, unmistakable.
But increasingly, and this is a global thing, we're seeing a different, much more deceptive form of, let's call it authoritarian consolidation. It's really not about brute force anymore. It's about a meticulous, almost surgical weaponization of legal processes.
Absolutely. So our mission today is to do a real deep dive into this phenomenon.
Yeah.
Authoritarianism's legal mask. Erosion by a thousand cuts. We want to reveal how modern autocrats aren't just seizing power through, obvious force.
Right.
Instead, they win, and I'm using air quotes there, by meticulously weaponizing existing laws, establish legal frameworks. They create this highly deceptive facade of legality, while fundamentally undermining the core principles that actually define a democracy.
And we'll be pulling key insights from leading scholars in political science and law, mixing that with some really compelling real-world case studies from different parts of the globe.
Yeah.
Our goal isn't just for you, the listener, to walk away informed, but to be truly equipped with a more refined analytical framework. Something that helps you recognize these subtle assaults on liberty when they happen, even when they're cloaked in what looks, on the surface, like perfectly legitimate legal procedure.
Okay, so here's the roadmap. We'll start by exploring this really surprising shift in how authoritarian power gets consolidated today, moving away from that overt force towards legal manipulation.
Then we'll dive into the core theoretical concepts that scholars use to explain this erosion. Things like executive aggrandizement, stealth authoritarianism, and autocratic legalism. These terms really help frame what's happening.
Got it. And after that, we'll examine some, frankly, chillingly consistent comparative examples. We're talking Hungary, Turkey, India, Poland.
Yeah, seeing the patterns across countries is key.
Definitely. And finally, we'll dissect the legalistic justifications these leaders often give, like the unitary executive theory, especially in the U.S. context. And crucially, we'll explore why these arguments fundamentally fail to uphold the spirit of true democracy. This is where the mechanisms, I think, get really fascinating. Let's unpack this. So yeah, when we picture democracies falling, our minds usually jump straight to tanks in the streets, right? That dramatic image. But what's the latest research telling us about how power really gets consolidated today? Are those images still accurate, or is something, well, sneakier going on?
It's a really profound shift. I mean, think about the 20th century military coups were almost standard practice in some regions like Latin America or parts of Africa.
Sure.
But what our sources are highlighting is a stark contrast to that historical pattern. Modern power grabs, especially the ones carried out by leaders who initially came to power through, legitimate elections.
Right. That's a key difference.
It is. Those leaders very rarely use those overt, violent displays of force anymore. The cost, frankly, both domestically and internationally, has just become too high. It attracts too much negative attention, sanctions, that sort of thing.
So instead, what are we seeing? You mentioned this weaponization of law.
Exactly. What we're seeing is a strategic, really systematic weaponization of laws and established legal processes to entrench power. This isn't about, an outright revolution with guns blazing.
Yeah.
It's more about a meticulous, almost bureaucratic subversion of the system from within. The key goal is to create and maintain this crucial facade of legality.
And that facade serves a purpose, right?
A dual purpose, really.
Yeah.
Domestically, it legitimizes the actions. It makes them appear normal, part of the regular political process. And perhaps even more importantly, internationally, it helps deflect or maybe even entirely avoid the kind of global backlash that a naked coup would inevitably provoke.
So it keeps things looking legitimate on the outside, even while the foundations are crumbling.
Precisely. And a very clear, very recent example of this. This weaponization of law, particularly as a kind of structural turning point in democratic practice, is the U.S. Supreme Court ruling in Trump v. United States. That was the 2024 case.
Ah, yes, the immunity case.
That's the one. It dealt with that highly contentious issue of presidential immunity from criminal prosecution. Now, the court held that presidents have what it called absolute immunity for acts that fall within their exclusive constitutional authority.
Meaning they just can't be touched for those specific acts at all.
Pretty much. Can't be sued, can't be prosecuted for those specific acts. And then for most other official acts, they get what the court called presumptive immunity.
Okay, presumptive. So not absolute, but still hard to challenge.
Extremely hard. While a lawsuit isn't entirely barred, the burden of proof you'd need to overcome that immunity is incredibly high. It makes legal challenges exceedingly difficult in practice.
Wow. So the practical implications of that are huge, aren't they? I mean, such a broad legal shield dramatically lower the expected cost of abuses a president might commit, especially if those abuses could be framed or sort of disguised as official acts.
Absolutely. And the historical echoes here are really profound. It directly recalls Richard Nixon's infamous claim, the one he made after he resigned.
When the president does it, that means it is not illegal.
That exact quote. It perfectly captures the danger.
It does.
This isn't just some abstract legal point. It gives potential strongman leaders with those authoritarian tendencies much greater cover to disregard the law. It acts as a mechanism, really, that allows autocrats to effectively launder power grabs through law.
Launder power grabs.
Yeah.
That's a striking phrase.
Because that's what they do. By manipulating or rewriting the rules or just exploiting existing legal loopholes, they can consolidate their authority, achieve these illiberal ends, but without triggering the severe global condemnation and sanctions that a more transparent, maybe violent overthrow would definitely invite. They present their actions as legitimate exercises of legal authority, even when their underlying intent is clearly to dismantle democratic checks.
And this whole strategy, it's been very aptly called a 2 by 1,000 cuts. That phrase really sticks.
It does. It captures the essence perfectly. It's not a single catastrophic blow. It's a slow, insidious process, a kind of nightmare scenario where democracy gets eroded slowly, piece by piece, through countless subtle legal changes, rather than one sudden, violent event.
Yeah. Political scientist Brendan Nyhan put it really well, didn't he? He observed that the story of democratic erosion in other countries is that it happens invisibly. You don't have a tanks in the streets moment.
And that invisibility is exactly what makes it so dangerous and so difficult to counter. Democratic backsliding, unlike those dramatic coups of the past, often creeps in under the cover of legal normalcy.
Right.
The leaders who are really bent on establishing autocratic rule, they rely heavily on this veneer of lawful procedure to mask profoundly illiberal ends. And what's so insidious about this approach, this sort of lawful form with illiberal function, is that it often fools many observers into believing that, well, nothing illegal is going on.
And that's the absolute core of the deception, isn't it? Because from the outside looking in maybe an international body, a foreign government, everything appears to be operating within the law. No tanks, no obvious suppression.
Exactly. But underneath that veneer of legal normalcy, the neutral referees and accountability mechanisms are being systematically disabled.
The referees.
Yeah.
Like judges, prosecutors.
No. Judges, prosecutors, election officials, independent media, civil service watchdogs. The very institutions designed to hold power in check. They're being meticulously undermined, not usually through overt attacks, but through this kind of legal re-engineering, changing the rules, changing personnel, changing jurisdiction.
All done legally on paper.
All done legally. And this isn't an isolated phenomenon happening in just one region or one type of political system. What our sources clearly show is a disturbing global consistency. Modern authoritarians, whether it's Hungary in Central Europe, India and South Asia, or even certain trends we see emerging in the U.S., they're employing strikingly similar legalistic tactics to consolidate power.
So it suggests a shared playbook, like they're learning from each other.
It really does seem like there's a strategic learning process across different contexts on how best to manipulate the law to achieve these autocratic goals while maintaining that crucial facade.
Okay, so just to recap briefly, we've established how the whole paradigm for democratic erosion has fundamentally shifted. It's really not about the traditional overt coups with tanks anymore. Right. Instead, modern autocrats are pulling off this coup by 1,000 cuts, strategically weaponizing laws and legal processes. This lets them keep up a deceptive veneer of lawful procedure, which makes these assaults on democracy incredibly hard to spot and challenge both at home and internationally.
And that 2024 U.S. Supreme Court ruling on presidential immunity serves as a prime example of this kind of structural inflection point. It effectively lowered the cost of potential abuses done under the guise of official acts, giving a kind of legal shield to actions that might otherwise be seen as clear overreaches of power.
Okay, now that we've laid that foundation, understanding how modern authoritarians operate, let's equip ourselves with the theoretical tools. How do scholars actually break down how they do it? You mentioned some specific mechanisms.
Yes, exactly. Scholars have identified these specific recurring mechanisms that elected leaders use to legally, incrementally erode democracy. Let's start with Nancy Bermeo's concept, executive aggrandizement.
Okay, executive aggrandizement. She identified this as kind of the modern way power gets consolidated, right? Where elected executives subtly, systematically weaken checks and balances, not by force, but through institutional changes.
Precisely. Executive aggrandizement involves these elected executives systematically weakening checks and balances one by one. It's not a sudden assault, it's methodical. It happens through a series of institutional changes that hamper the opposition's ability to challenge executive preferences.
So instead of just suspending the Constitution, which would be an obvious red flag.
Right, that's too blatant. Instead, the autocrat incrementally dilutes the power of courts, legislatures, and oversight bodies, bit by bit.
And what's particularly sneaky about this, as Bermeo found, is that these tactics often get legitimated by the very institutions democracy promoters prioritize. It's a bit mind-bending.
It is, isn't it? Think about that. The very mechanisms we trust to safeguard democracy constitutions, regular elections, established laws, they get twisted. They're turned into instruments for executive domination rather than accountability. The forms are still there, but their function is totally perverted.
Can you give us a way to visualize that?
Sure. Imagine a sturdy, three-legged stool. That's your healthy democracy. Each leg, executive, legislature, judiciary, provides essential balance. Now, executive aggrandizement isn't like the executive leg breaking the other two legs.
Okay.
Instead, it's like that executive leg subtly, patiently, and legally shaving thin slivers off the other two legs over time. The stool still stands, it still has three legs, it might even look stable from a distance.
But it's tilting.
Exactly. Its balance is increasingly compromised, tilting precariously in one direction, even though it doesn't immediately collapse. This gradual legal erosion makes the whole system fundamentally unstable, even if its outward appearance seems intact for a while.
That's a really powerful image. Okay, moving on. Law professor Ozan Varol brings in this concept of stealth authoritarianism. How does that fit in?
Varol uses this term for how this new generation of autocrats expertly cloak repressive practices under the mask of law.
Cloaking repression.
Yeah. Varol argues that post-Cold War authoritarians learned a crucial lesson. Overt violence and illegal power grabs are just too costly. Too much international heat, too much domestic resistance. So they adapted. They learned to perpetuate power through the same legal mechanisms as democracies, using courts, using elections, using legislatures, rather than resorting to direct, undeniable violence.
And by doing that, by operating through these seemingly legitimate channels, their actions gain that critical veneer of legitimacy.
Precisely. Which makes these anti-democratic moves incredibly harder to detect for both the people living under them and for international observers. It's like a magic trick. Almost the repression is hidden in plain sight, dressed up as legal procedure.
Can you give a concrete example of that?
Sure. Instead of overtly throwing journalists in jail without any cause, which would immediately set off alarm bells about press freedom, a stealth autocrat might pass broadly worded media laws.
Laws that sound reasonable on the surface.
Exactly. They might be framed around national security or preventing fake news or public order, but their vague language allows the courts, who are ostensibly just acting by the book, to do the censoring. It maintains this false appearance of due process.
So the courts become the tool of repression, but it looks like they're just applying the law.
That's the mechanism. As Princeton's Kim Lane Chappell puts it so well, these tactics hide autocratic designs in the pluralism of legitimate legal forms. The repression gets hidden within the very legal structures that are supposed to protect rights.
Which leads us perfectly to Chappell's own term, autocratic legalism. What does she mean by that?
Autocratic legalism is when leaders specifically use constitutional or legal methods to accomplish their aims, and they do it with explicit electoral backing.
Okay, so the election win is key here.
It's central. This is the classic scenario we see playing out again and again. A charismatic leader wins a popular election, often with a big majority. They then claim this democratic mandate, the will of the people expressed at the ballot box, justifies removing checks on their power through legal reforms.
And they'll often say,
You'll hear them insist that the majority's will should simply override any of those technocratic guardrails, any protections for minority rights. The common phrase you'll hear is, elections have consequences.
right, implying the consequences, they get to do whatever they want.
Pretty much. And the outcome of this, as Scheppel points out, leads to a critical distinction. You end up with rule by law instead of the rule of law.
Okay, explain that difference again. Rule by law versus rule of law.
In a healthy democracy, the rule of law means everyone, including the most powerful leaders, is bound by a consistent, impartial legal framework. The law is above everyone. But rule by law means the law is just a tool in the hands of the powerful. It's used to legitimize their decisions, whatever those decisions might be, rather than constraining them.
So the forms of democracy, elections, statutes, courts, they all technically remain in place.
Yes, they do. But they are hollowed out of their real substantive protective function. Scheppel issues a really stark warning here. When electoral mandates plus constitutional change are used in service of an illiberal agenda, that's the definitive sign. That's when the regime has slid into autocratic legalism.
And it's gradual, right? And legal.
Crucially, yes.
Right.
Gradual and legal. It's not a sudden break. Scheppel writes, and this is important, loosening the bonds of constitutional constraint on executive power through legal reform is the first sign of the autocratic legalist. It's a series of seemingly small, legally defensible steps that, taken together, dismantle democratic safeguards.
Can we visualize this one too?
Let's try. Think of the rule of law as a really complex, finely tuned machine, like an intricate clock. It's designed to produce fair and just outcomes, and it has lots of internal safety mechanisms, checks, and balances. Autocratic legalism is like someone systematically re-engineering that machine's internal logic. They're not smashing the parts, but they're rewiring it with seemingly innocuous legal adjustments. So, the machine continues to function formally. The gears turn, the lights blink, it looks like it's working.
But it's producing different outcomes.
Exactly. It now produces the desired illiberal outcomes for the autocrat while still appearing to follow its own rules. The machine is still there, but its purpose has been subtly yet fundamentally altered. The substance is gutted, even as the form persists.
That makes sense. So, across all these concepts, executive aggrandizement, stealth authoritarianism, autocratic legalism, what's the common thread?
The common thread, the recurring pattern in all of them, is this incremental lawful erosion. Instead of blatantly violating the Constitution, which would be a clear red line, these would-be autocrats exploit its flexibility. They use its ambiguities, sometimes even its silences.
So they don't smash the system, they bend it.
They bend it. They meticulously pass laws, issue decrees, and secure court rulings that cumulatively tilt the playing field in their favor. And what's absolutely critical here, the really chilling part, is that the independent figures, judges, prosecutors, election officials, the media, even civil servants—
The referees.
The referees of democracy, exactly. They are gradually removed or neutralized under legal pretexts. It's all done by the book, or at least by a carefully rewritten book.
Neutralizing the referees, that's powerful.
As one analysis put it really effectively, effective authoritarians tighten their grip gradually, stealthily, undermining courts, legislatures, election officials, news organizations, and other institutions strong enough to check them.
In the end game, what's the final outcome of this process?
The final outcome is a system where the forms of democracy still exist. You might still have elections, parliament might still meet, courts might still issue rulings, but power becomes so concentrated, so unchecked, that true liberal democracy is gone. The actual substance of liberty and accountability has just vanished, leaving only a hollow shell behind.
And this isn't just theory, is it? You mentioned the VDEM report.
Right. This isn't just academic theorizing or isolated incidents. The VDEM 2025 report, which is a highly respected global survey of democracy, finds that the world is currently in what they call a third wave of autocratization.
A third wave.
Yeah. And the statistic is sobering. Autocracies now actually outnumber democracies globally. And liberal democracies, the ones with strong protections for rights and rule of law, are at their lowest number in decades.
Wow. So what does that global trend really mean for us, for understanding this?
It means that understanding these subtle, legalistic forms of erosion is more critical than ever before. The global trend is clearly moving away from, rather than towards, liberal democratic governance right now.
Yeah.
The very nature of democratic decline has changed, and we need a new lens, these concepts we've discussed, to really grasp it.
Okay, let's take a breath there. We've really uncovered the core intellectual frameworks for understanding this stealthy kind of democratic decline: executive aggrandizement, stealth authoritarianism, and autocratic legalism. These frameworks shed light on how elected leaders use these incremental lawful processes to systematically weaken checks and balances, how they cloak repressive practices in legal clothing, and how they use election wins to basically hollow out the rule of law.
And the common thread is that gradual, lawful process that systematically neutralizes the independent institutions, those referees, that are essential for a thriving democracy.
And importantly, this isn't just theory. It reflects that disturbing global trend identified by the VDEM 2025 report, this third wave of autocratization and the decline in liberal democracies worldwide. Okay, now let's see these concepts in action. Let's look at some real-world examples.
Right, let's move from the theory to the, well, chilling reality. We're going to look at how this autocratic legal erosion follows what seems like a disturbingly consistent script across different countries, even different continents. These comparative examples really give us a sense of the global pattern, a kind of blueprint for how democracies are being undermined from within, always under that cloak of legality.
Where should we start? Hungary.
Let's start with Hungary and Prime Minister Viktor Orban's constitutional rewrite. This is often cited as a textbook case. After winning the election back in 2010, Orban and his Fidesz party secured a parliamentary supermajority.
And that supermajority is the crucial detail, isn't it?
Absolutely crucial, because it meant they had the power to amend the Constitution itself, pretty much at will. They were effectively unchecked by parliamentary opposition when it came to changing the fundamental rules of the game.
And they didn't waste any time, did they?
No, they moved fast. They immediately used this supermajority power to rewrite Hungary's constitution and legal code on a massive scale. And we're not talking minor tweaks here. This was a wholesale overhaul designed specifically to centralize power and dismantle previously independent institutions.
Which institutions did they target?
Their actions systematically attacked the independence of crucial institutions. The list includes the judiciary, the media, the prosecutor's office, the tax authority, even the election commission. All vital independent bodies in any functioning democracy.
And how did they do it?
Well, one of the very first targets was the Constitutional Court itself. According to the sources, it was effectively captured after 3 years. This was then followed by a pretty comprehensive purge of opposition figures from public institutions, removing anyone not seen as loyal.
It wasn't just purges, though, right? There were other tactics.
Oh, yeah. Orban's lawmakers extended the terms of key officials, making sure loyalists stayed in positions of power for much longer. They packed agencies with loyalists, filling them with individuals whose primary allegiance was clearly to the ruling Fidesz party, not to impartial duty. And they even went so far as to change parliamentary rules to silence opposition MPs, basically stifling dissent within the legislature itself.
So with that two-thirds majority, letting them change any law or the Constitution whenever they wanted.
Right. Orban executed what Kim Lane-Schibbel vividly described as an autocratic revolution with exquisite legal precision.
Exquisite legal precision. That's the key phrase again.
It really is. Because elections continued, new laws were passed, everything appeared to be following constitutional procedure. But the outcome was undeniable. Virtually all independent checks courts, media, prosecutors, central bank, etc., were brought under Fidesz control.
Creating a de facto one-party state.
Essentially, yes, a de facto one-party state hidden behind this impressive yet ultimately hollow legal facade of constitutional amendments and formally duly enacted statutes.
Okay, a powerful example. Let's turn to Turkey next. President Erdogan. His case seems like a textbook example of using a crisis to legalize autocracy.
It really is. After that failed coup attempt in July 2016, Erdogan declared a state of emergency. And that state of emergency lasted for 2 full years.
And that emergency period was the window, wasn't it?
It was the critical window for consolidating power. During those 2 years, his government issued an incredible 31 emergency decrees. Many of these, according to legal analysts, far exceeded the constitutional limits on emergency powers. And crucially, these decrees completely bypassed Parliament.
Allowing him to rule by decree, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. Legislating by executive fiat, which dramatically accelerated his agenda.
And what did he do under this cover of emergency?
Well, he proceeded to purge over 110,000 public servants. That number is staggering. It included vast numbers of judges, academics, civil servants, basically anyone suspected of disloyalty.
Wow.
He also shuttered opposition media and NGOs, effectively silencing critical voices, and he restructured military and judicial institutions by decree. Now, what's particularly alarming is that many of these changes were made permanent. Their impact extended far beyond the emergency period itself, fundamentally reshaping the Turkish state.
And this all led to a constitutional change.
It culminated in a really significant constitutional shift. In 2017, Erdogan pushed through constitutional amendments transforming Turkey from a parliamentary system into a highly centralized presidential system. This new constitution essentially codified the massive expansion of powers he had already assumed under the emergency rule.
So what powers does the president have now in Turkey?
Well, now the president has the authority to rule by decree, appoint key officials pretty much at will, declare future states of emergency, even dissolve parliament and all this, with effectively no check by the judiciary or the legislature. What had been de facto power during the emergency, this near-absolute executive dominance became de jure, enshrined in law under Turkey's new system, often described as absolutist presidentialism.
So again, through legal changes, ratified by referendum even.
Yes, ratified by referendum. He achieved this one-man regime that still operates through laws, but in substance, it completely ignores core rule of law principles like checks and balances and judicial independence.
Okay, so we've just explored how Hungary's Orbán used that parliamentary supermajority to rewrite the constitution from the ground up, and how Turkey's Erdogan leveraged a crisis to issue sweeping emergency decrees. Both clear, legalistic paths to concentrating power and dismantling those crucial checks and balances. What about other parts of the world?
Well, let's continue this global tour of legalistic democratic backsliding by looking at India, which is interesting because for a long time, India was held up as one of the world's most robust, most vibrant democracies.
Right, the world's largest democracy. But under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, things have shifted.
They have. Observers describe it as steady backsliding by ostensibly legal means.
And again, it's crucial to stress this point. Since Modi took office in 2014, observers consistently note that India's democratic decline did not occur through an illegal coup. It occurred through legal means. This is exactly that thousand cuts idea we're discussing. It makes it really hard to pinpoint one single moment where democracy failed. It's cumulative.
Exactly. The Modi government and his BJP party have consistently worked to centralize power in the executive, and in doing so, they've systematically undermined the institutional safeguards that were designed to prevent exactly that kind of concentration.
How specifically? What tactics have they used?
Well, it includes things like politicizing the civil service and investigative agencies. This strips them of their neutrality, effectively turning them into instruments of the ruling party rather than impartial bodies. They've also been accused of pressuring or sidelining dissenters in the judiciary, which of course compromises judicial independence. And they've used their majority in parliament to pass laws that curb opposition and civil society.
So it's not just about undermining institutions, but also rights.
Yes, the erosion extends to rights as well. Free speech and minority rights in particular have been steadily eroded. Often this happens via legislation and bureaucratic orders that look neutral on the surface.
For example?
For example, there have been significant crackdowns on NGOs and media organizations. These are often justified under tightened rules regarding foreign funding or national security. These rules are implemented through existing legal frameworks, but critics argue they're applied with an illiberal intent, basically, to stifle dissent and criticism.
And what's particularly deceptive about Modi's signature moves, according to the sources, is that they often meticulously invoke legal authority. They follow the letter of the law, even while potentially violating its spirit.
A really prominent example often cited is the surprise revocation of Kashmir's autonomous status back in 2019. This was a huge move, altering a long-standing constitutional arrangement. But it was executed via a technical parliamentary procedure, giving it this appearance of legitimacy, even though it sparked widespread criticism and fundamentally changed the status quo.
And the cumulative effect of all these actions.
The cumulative effect has been to undermine federalism, the balance of power between the central government and the states, and to significantly weaken independent institutions. As one analysis summarizes it, India's backsliding has been accelerated by Modi's centralization of power, judicial harassment of critics, and increasing intimidation of the opposition. And importantly, all of this carried out within a legal framework.
So the result is what many now call a flawed democracy.
That's the term often used. A flawed democracy where those key checks like a truly neutral election commission, a nonpartisan bureaucracy, a genuinely free press are all under immense strain. This is happening even though elections still take place and courts still exist on paper. Again, the form persists, but the substantive democratic quality is clearly diminished.
Okay, let's look at one more European example. Poland. The Law and Justice Party, PS.
Yes, Poland, under the PS party, provides another clear European example of this autocratic legalism. After winning power in 2015, PS, which was led ideologically by Jarosław Kaczyński, embarked on a very deliberate campaign to restructure the judiciary and the prosecutorial system.
Now, interestingly, unlike Orban in Hungary, PS lacked the two-thirds majority needed to change the constitution outright. That must have presented a challenge for them.
It did. It forced them to be more creative, legally speaking. So instead of a big constitutional overhaul, they passed a flurry of ordinary laws to achieve similar ends. This really demonstrates the adaptability of these legalistic approaches. If one route is blocked, they find another within the existing legal system.
What was the key move they made?
A really key move happened in 2016. PS merged the roles of the Justice Minister and the Prosecutor General. This formally placed all prosecutors under direct government control.
And how did they justify that?
Well, the PS minister at the time, Zbigniew Ziobro, justified it by arguing that such an important authority needed strong democratic-based supervision by the elected executive, appealing to democratic legitimacy, you see.
Is that the result?
The result, however, was clearly a prosecution service that became subordinated to the executive. It transformed from an ideally impartial body into a political tool, often used, critics argued, to target political opponents or to quash inconvenient investigations.
And did they target prosecutors themselves?
Yes. Paris then used its control of personnel and disciplinary rules to purge or intimidate independent prosecutors. They introduced new legal provisions that allowed the justice minister to essentially arbitrarily replace or reassign cases and prosecutors, which effectively hollowed out any real independence within the prosecutorial hierarchy. Loyalty flowed upwards to the political leadership.
And they targeted the judiciary at the same time.
Simultaneously, yes. Paris enacted laws designed to pack the Constitutional Tribunal and the Supreme Court with loyalists, ensuring sympathetic rulings on key government initiatives. They also forced the early retirement of many judges, clearing the way for their own appointments. And to really deter dissent within the judiciary, they created a controversial new disciplinary chamber, specifically designed to punish judges who ruled against government interests.
So how bad did it get?
By 2018, Freedom House, the global democracy watchdog, reported that PS had achieved direct control over the Constitutional Court and the crucial Judicial Appointments Council. They described it as amounting to a constitutional coup d'etat, all achieved via ordinary legislation, not constitutional change.
And how did PS frame all of this publicly?
Throughout this entire process, PS consistently claimed they were simply democratizing and cleansing. What they alleged was a corrupt, inefficient post-communist judiciary. They framed their actions as necessary reforms to improve efficiency and accountability, tapping into genuine public frustration with judicial backlogs.
But in
reality, critics argue they were clearly leveraging legal authority to eliminate checks on its power. They systematically turned courts and prosecutors into mere extensions of the ruling party's will, rather than letting them function as independent arbiters of justice.
So whether it's Hungary's Orban rewriting the constitution with his supermajority,
or Turkey's Erdogan using emergency decrees after a crisis,
or India's Modi centralizing power through legislation and bureaucracy,
or Poland's PiS capturing the judiciary through ordinary laws.
These diverse cases really illustrate a chillingly consistent script, don't they? They're all variations on this theme of legalistic erosion, achieving these illiberal ends through apparently lawful forms.
We've now seen how India's Modi centralized executive power through legislative means, and how Poland's PS systematically captured the judiciary and prosecution. These examples really illustrate the varied but ultimately converging tactics of this legalistic erosion of democracy.
What these comparative cases really powerfully demonstrate is how these autocrats exploit legal loopholes and institutional weaknesses that are specific to their own country's particular legal and political setup. Each path is, as you said, tailored.
Exactly. Orban used constitutional amendments because he had the supermajority. Erdogan leveraged emergency decrees after that coup attempt. Modi used majoritarian legislation and bureaucratic controls within India's system. And Poland's PS, because they lacked that supermajority for constitutional change, focused cleverly on ordinary legislation and politicized appointments to achieve very similar ends.
But the truly disturbing point, the convergence, is that despite these different legal avenues, all these paths converge on the same outcome, don't they?
They absolutely do. The outcome is always neutral arbiters are removed, and the executive's actions face fewer and fewer constraints. Those independent institutions that are meant to act as checks on power are systematically dismantled or brought under political control, leaving the executive largely unconstrained and unaccountable.
And you mentioned earlier this idea of inter-regime learning.
Yeah.
That this convergence isn't just accidental.
No, there's clear evidence suggesting it's not accidental. The playbook seems so common that autocrats even learn from one another. For instance, Orban in Hungary openly borrowed tactics from Putin's Russia, things like bringing courts and local governments to heel. He also borrowed from Erdogan's Turkey, particularly on court-packing strategies disguised as efficiency reforms.
And then Poland copied Orban.
And then Poland's PS, in turn, copied elements from Orban's strategies, like using forced early judicial retirement to clear the way for appointing loyalists. It's a kind of authoritarian learning that happens across regimes.
A sharing of best practices for undermining democracy.
Essentially, yes, a sharing of best practices for undermining democracy, all while maintaining that crucial appearance of legitimacy. And the consistent thread through all of it is that these sophisticated power grabs are all done in polite legal dress. No tanks, no overt violence, just the quiet, meticulous manipulation of the law itself, creating what looks like a legitimate transformation, but is actually hollowing out democracy from within.
Okay, another major point covered.
Yeah.
We've delved into these specific case studies, Hungary, Turkey, India, Poland, and observed this consistent pattern. Leaders using a wide range of legal tactics, from constitutional rewrites and emergency decrees to legislative changes and judicial packing, all aimed at systematically dismantling democratic checks and balances while meticulously maintaining that facade of legality.
And we highlighted that global trend even includes this disturbing element of authoritarian learning, where these illiberal regimes borrow and adapt successful tactics from one another to further their goals.
And what about the justifications? How did these leaders sell these moves?
Right, let's pivot to what might be the most insidious part of this whole strategy: the narratives of justification. Because would-be autocrats rarely, if ever, stand up and say, yes, I'm deliberately undermining democracy.
No, that wouldn't go over well.
Not at all. Instead, they offer a whole host of legalistic justifications for their actions. They cloak their true intentions in these seemingly legitimate arguments designed to sound reasonable and even democratic.
What are some common refrains we hear?
You'll often hear statements like, we won the election, so we have a mandate to reorganize government as we see fit. This frames the election victory not just as a mandate to govern, but as an almost unlimited license to reshape the entire state apparatus from the executive branch right down to independent agencies.
Or they might invoke the Constitution itself.
Yes. Another common line is, the Constitution vests all executive power in the president. Therefore, independent agencies or prosecutors shouldn't defy me. This is where that concept of the unitary executive theory often comes into play, especially in the U.S. context.
Okay, let's break down that unitary executive theory because it's a powerful concept and often, I think, misunderstood. What's the core argument?
The core argument is essentially this. Because Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution places the executive power in one president. Proponents argue that, by extension, the president can control or remove all officials in the executive branch at will. It suggests a direct, singular, almost military-style line of command from the president down through every part of the executive bureaucracy.
That sounds incredibly expansive. Does it go further?
Oh, yes. Some proponents even suggest this theory gives a president the latitude to override statutes, laws passed by Congress, particularly in areas like national security. They argue the president's inherent executive power allows them to disregard laws if they deem it necessary for national security.
Which sounds dangerously close to it.
It sounds dangerously close to and is famously encapsulated by Richard Nixon's claim that fundamentally the president can't illegally act by definition, because whatever the president does, simply by virtue of being president, is inherently legal within this framework.
So a muscular interpretation of this theory basically says the president has the right to do whatever he wants as president.
That's a fair summary of the extreme view, yes. It suggests that during his term, traditional checks from Congress, from the courts, from independent agencies shouldn't really constrain his energy in executing policy. It paints this picture of an unencumbered executive, free to act decisively, unburdened by oversight or bureaucratic roadblocks.
Can we visualize this one too? The unitary executive idea.
Let's try. Imagine the U.S. government again as that sophisticated clockwork mechanism. You've got all the gears, the branches, the agencies, the oversight bodies moving in relation to each other. They're controlled by numerous springs and escapements. Those are the checks and balances, all designed to ensure a precise, limited function. Now, the unitary executive theory, especially when taken to its extreme, is like arguing that the main spring that's the president should be solely responsible for all the movement. It suggests the president has the right to remove or recalibrate or simply ignore any of the other gears or safety mechanisms that seem to slow down or divert its direct singular purpose. This interpretation essentially wants to strip away the very complexity and interconnectedness that are designed to ensure balanced, constrained government.
That analogy really highlights the inherent tension, doesn't it? Because the fundamental problem, the reason these arguments ultimately fail in a democratic context, is that such claims, when taken to their extreme, completely gut the separation of powers.
Exactly. And separation of powers is, of course, the absolute bedrock principle of any constitutional democracy.
The founders didn't intend for unchecked power anywhere, did they?
Absolutely not. The U.S. framers and liberal democratic theory more generally never intended unchecked power in any one branch. The entire design of constitutional government is predicated on the idea that while the president certainly has broad authority, that authority is deliberately supposed to be hemmed in by Congress through its power to pass laws, control budgets, conduct oversight.
And it's also constrained by independent institutions.
Yes, crucially. It's also constrained by independent institutions like courts and watchdog agencies. These aren't just accidental additions to the system, they are deliberate safeguards put there specifically to prevent the concentration of power that historically leads to tyranny.
But what we see, chillingly, is how autocrats invoke this very concept, the unitary executive, to justify purging or bypassing these watchdogs.
Right. They use it as a legal pretext, a justification to remove or neutralize the very institutions designed to hold them accountable. And that, fundamentally, is precisely what creates an imperial, unaccountable presidency, a leader who operates above the law, even if they're doing it under the guise of the law.
And we saw a stark illustration of this potential play out, didn't we? In a hypothetical scenario based on early 2025 actions of a potential new administration in the U.S.
Yes, the sources describe a scenario based on publicly stated plans and expert analysis. Citing expansive Article 2 powers invoking that unitary executive idea, this hypothetical administration undertook a rapid series of moves explicitly designed to centralize presidential control.
What kind of moves?
Well, it included things like hypothetically firing inspectors general who provided independent oversight, thereby eliminating those crucial internal watchdogs designed to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse within agencies.
Okay.
It also involved, hypothetically, suspending merit-based civil service rules to enable loyalty-based hiring and firing. This is often referred to as Schedule F. It would ensure that critical positions throughout the bureaucracy are filled by political loyalists rather than competent independent professionals chosen through merit systems.
And beyond personnel, did it touch independent bodies?
Yes. The scenario included moves to oust members of independent regulatory commissions. These are bodies like the FTC or FCC, meant to be free from direct political influence to ensure fair and consistent application of regulations. And it even went so far as to hypothetically impound congressionally appropriated funds contrary to statute.
Impounding funds.
Oh, cool.
That directly challenges Congress's power of the purse, right?
Absolutely. It undermines a core legislative check on executive power, effectively allowing the president to redirect funds that Congress had specifically appropriated for certain purposes.
And how would actions like these be defended?
Each of these steps in this scenario was defended as the president's prerogative under that expansive unitary executive theory. The president needs control to execute the laws effectively, they'd argue.
But
collectively, as legal analysts warned even before such actions, moves like these would brazenly step on Congress's constitutional powers. They would systematically disable the very guardrails and protections that were put in place specifically to prevent corruption and the abuse of power. Anti-corruption experts looking at these plans warned that such an administration could move quickly to undermine key U.S. anti-corruption protections and guardrails across the government, effectively reversing years of hard-won reforms and leaving the door wide open to potential malfeasance and cronyism.
It really paints a picture where, far from being a feature of a healthy democracy, this kind of unconstrained unitary executive power becomes the dream scenario for authoritarians.
It absolutely is, because it creates an environment that actively invites impunity.
Impunity, meaning they can act without consequence.
Think about it. If a leader can define anything they do as an official act and therefore claim immunity or argue it's beyond legal challenge, they gain free rein to harass rivals, enrich cronies, or violate rights with little consequence. There's no effective check.
And that combination you mentioned earlier, immunity plus control over personnel, that's the dangerous part.
That's why that combination immunity for official acts plus politicized control over personnel is so incredibly dangerous. It removes both the legal checks, potential prosecution or lawsuits, and the institutional checks, independent officials willing to say no or investigate all at once. It creates a system where the executive is effectively untouchable, capable of operating without genuine accountability.
So, a president shielded from prosecution, surrounded by yes-men who owe their jobs purely to loyalty. That's not the energetic executive the founders envisioned, is it?
Not at all. The founders envisioned an energetic executive, yes, but one bounded by the rule of law and accountable to the people through Congress and the courts. What you describe is something else entirely. It's an elected autocrat in the making.
And Kimley and Scheppel's point comes back here, doesn't it? About justifications versus reality.
It does. As Scheppel astutely observes, autocrats often justify these power grabs by insisting they're just carrying out the people's will, making government more efficient. But, as she warns, when autocratic leaders use constitutional and legal change in service of an illiberal agenda, the inevitable result is that democracy's substance is gutted even as its form remains. The neutral referees, those inspectors general, independent prosecutors, nonpartisan judges, ethics officials, they all get sidelined, leaving literally no one in a position to effectively enforce accountability against the executive.
Okay, let's pause there. We've really explored how these justifications, particularly the extreme version of the unitary executive theory, can be weaponized. They're used to centralize power, creating what we call an imperial, unaccountable presidency, and they do this by systematically dismantling the very separation of powers that's the bedrock of constitutional democracy.
Right. The core issue is that this theory, in its extreme form, lets the executive become the sole judge of its own actions, effectively removing all those crucial external legal and institutional checks and paving the way for impunity.
So how does this connect back to that broader notion we hear all the time in politics? Elections have consequences.
Well, the thing is, that common political slogan, elections have consequences, really cuts both ways. Winning an election certainly gives a leader a mandate to govern, to implement their policies, but not, crucially, to rule without constraint. And that's the distinction that authoritarians deliberately try to blur. They argue their electoral victory grants them absolute authority to reshape everything.
Whereas liberal democracies are built on a kind of paradox.
Exactly. They're built on this fundamental paradox. They vest significant authority in elected leaders, yes, but they simultaneously bind that authority with strict institutional limits. Those limits, what we call checks and balances, are not bugs in the system. They are features intended to prevent tyranny. They are the very essence of a constrained liberal government, specifically designed to ensure no single branch or individual can accumulate too much power.
So any attempt to remove all those checks, even if done under the cover of legal authority, confirms exactly what Bermeo and Varol described earlier.
Precisely. It's that lawful form, illiberal function. A regime where the leader can effectively do anything they claim is legal, simply because they've managed to redefine legality to suit themselves. Well, that regime ceases to be meaningfully democratic. It might still hold elections, the courts might technically still exist, but the actual substance of democratic governance, particularly accountability and constraint, is gone. The legal framework has been warped into an instrument of unchecked power.
And again, this isn't just a theoretical warning about some distant future, is it? The V-Dem project had specific findings about the U.S. recently.
That's right. The Varieties of Democracy Project, V-Dem, found in its 2025 report that the United States is currently experiencing its fastest ever episode of democratic erosion. That's an incredibly alarming finding for such an established democracy.
And what characterizes that erosion?
It's characterized, according to VDEM, by the executive testing the limits of power at an unprecedented scale, specifically by undermining oversight bodies, attacking the media, and dismantling state institutions. These are the classic moves of autocratic legalism, the thousand cuts playing out in real time.
And scholars associated with VDEM have issued warnings.
Yes, scholars like Stefan Lindberg of VDEM offer a really stark caution based on these trends. He warns that if such trends continue unchecked, America could, potentially in short order, no longer qualify as a democracy, no longer even a constitutional republic. That highlights the real and present danger of this subtle legalistic erosion, even in countries with long democratic traditions.
Wow, so the bottom line here seems chillingly clear. Law itself becomes the autocrat's weapon.
That's the fundamental takeaway. By twisting existing laws, by strategically stacking courts with loyalists, and by invoking doctrines like this extreme version of the unitary executive theory, modern authoritarians manage to create a legal shield around abusive power.
Which presents a profound challenge for democracy's defenders, doesn't it?
It's a huge challenge, because it means you have to recognize these tactics for what they truly are. Just because an action is carried out via a duly enacted statute or a seemingly legitimate court ruling does not automatically make it benign or democratic in spirit. You have to look at the substance, the effect, not just the form.
And history gives us precedents for this kind of legal abuse.
Sadly, yes. History provides ample precedent. Some of the most devastating assaults on human freedom in the past. Think about systems like apartheid, or periods of emergency rule that slid into full-blown dictatorships, were often done legally. They meticulously followed the letter of the existing law while completely violating its spirit, its underlying purpose to protect rights and ensure justice for all.
So the crucial guardrail we need to watch, the real litmus test when evaluating these legal changes, is...
The litmus test is whether these legal and constitutional changes genuinely serve a neutral, accountable governance. Meaning, do they strengthen mechanisms for transparency, for oversight, for holding power accountable? Or, conversely, are they primarily designed for concentrating power and removing oversight?
And when it's the latter?
When it's definitively the latter, when the consistent effect of the changes is to centralize power and dismantle accountability, then we are squarely in the realm of autocratic erosion in lawful clothing, no matter how legally sophisticated the justification sounds.
So the core insight really is that these legal systems, which we rely on to be robust guardrails for freedom, can, terrifyingly, be turned into the very instruments of freedom's demise if we aren't constantly vigilant and analytically precise in distinguishing that legal form from its actual function.
That's exactly right. Vigilance and analytical clarity are paramount.
Okay, to bring this really deep dive to a close, let's just reiterate that central thesis one more time. Modern autocrats have evolved. They really do prefer lawyers to tanks now. They will meticulously cloak purges as necessary reforms. They'll cunningly justify blatant power grabs as promoting efficient governance. And they will always cite some form of legal authority for actions that are, when you look closely, blatantly anti-democratic in spirit and effect.
And because of that subtlety, it falls squarely to vigilant institutions, to our lawmakers, our courts, the media, and just as importantly, a robust, engaged civil society to recognize these tactics for what they truly are, an abuse of the law itself designed ultimately to extinguish liberty.
And this requires a really sharp analytical eye, doesn't it? Because the subtle nature of these changes means they can easily be overlooked or maybe dismissed as just minor procedural adjustments or maybe necessary responses to crises.
Absolutely. And the ultimate danger here is profound. Without sustained intelligent pushback based on understanding these mechanisms, a democracy can indeed be slowly smothered in legalism. It happens gradually until one day you realize the forms of freedom might still remain. You still have elections, courts still exist on paper, but the very soul, the substantive liberal democratic principles of accountability, checks and balances, individual rights, that soul has tragically vanished.
So the monumental task, really, for all of us who cherish liberty, is to prevent that outcome. It's to ensure that law remains what it was intended to be, a robust guardrail for freedom.
And not, horrifyingly, the enemy within. The law should serve justice and protect rights, not become the tool used for their systematic dismantling.
Okay, let's end with a provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over, especially given the focus of this deep dive. Considering the systemic, incremental nature of this erosion by 1,000 cuts, what mathematical models, perhaps, or historical philosophical frameworks might best help us predict the tipping point, that moment where democratic resilience truly collapses under this pressure?
And maybe from a more strategic perspective, how might one develop a kind of game theory approach? How could we identify the most effective, maybe the most efficient counter strategies to these subtle legalistic assaults? Especially given that the resources of democratic defenders are often limited compared to the seemingly endless array of subtle attacks a state can mount.
This isn't just about understanding history, is it? It's really about applying foresight to protect the future of democratic governance. Something to think about. Thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive.